Okay, now I'm going to change the subject a bit and talk about the abduction phenomenon. These are people who claim to have been taken, usually in their sleep, sometimes from their car, and have things happen to them. You know, we hear stories of women who are made pregnant on spaceships and give birth to hybrid children, presumably. Now, if someone is skeptical of this, and I do believe we need more evidence of this, I would recommend read Professor John Mack's books. Professor John Mack was a Harvard professor who was very, very skeptical of the abduction phenomenon. And he was sent, I think, just one by one, just under 100 patients. Now, he thought that these patients were all suffering from some kind of psychosis. And he just thought, well, maybe I'll write a paper on people who believe they're being abducted because they've got this psychosis. And one by one, after he'd investigated, I think it was around about 100 cases, he came out and he concluded that the vast majority of them were reliving or were telling him about real experiences. Some of them had physical marks on their body, and he, as I say, he was head of Harvard University's psychiatry department. You can't get much more prestigious than that. And they tried to get rid of him, but they failed. And I would recommend read any of his books if you want evidence that this abduction phenomenon is real. And one person that I think people overlook quite a bit in ufology is Dan Sherman. And I think his evidence sheds light on the abduction phenomenon, although he's not an abductee, he doesn't know any abductees, he worked for the military. And what happened to Sherman was, he joined the military in 1982 as a young man. He was in the American Air Force, and he was given a top secret clearance, and he was drafted into a particular program where he was sent to a secret NSA facility, that's the National Security Agency. And he became involved in this secret project. And it was so secret that he was picked up from his hotel room each day in a blacked out vehicle, and he wasn't allowed to know any of the entrance points or exactly where he was going. And he was also given 2 jobs at this facility, or one of the facilities where he worked. So in other words, during the day from 9 to 5, he was working on, I think it was electronics intelligence work. He had a normal job, and then he would do another 8 hours in this secret job, and that gives them a cover story as to what his role was in the military. Now, he would be taken into this secret base, and he was trained on allegedly alien technology which the American government had been given to them. Now, it sounds far-fetched, but I find Dan Sherman, if you read his book, he is one of the most convincing whistleblowers in my opinion. He's not tried to profit from his story. He's not particularly a conference goer, and his information for me is a concrete witness. I'm just going to let him explain the introduction part of his story.
And at some point I was kind of led to another job, which was electronic intelligence. This job provided me access to a higher security classification, and so I got top secret clearances and SCI clearances, and so that led me into a world where well, to back up, the military kind of had a plan for me as it was revealed later on, but at this point I didn't know that was going on. But evidently, and it was after I had gone into this other electronic intelligence field, that I went to a school to get trained for it, and I was called into an office, a captain's office. He was in charge of the school, I believe it was, and I went into his office, and he revealed this amazing story to me. Evidently, at birth, or actually in the womb, I was genetically managed to have a particular ability, and this ability was what he called intuitive communications. And how this happened was, and this is where, you know, a lot of people roll their eyes, and I rolled my eyes at the time, and I was like, I can't believe this has happened to me. But he said that my mother was abducted when she was pregnant with me, and the fetus, which was me, was genetically managed, and he said everybody had this particular ability that I was genetically managed for, but mine was just heightened to an nth degree. I was at the school to not only learn a certain particular procedure for my job, my regular job, electronic intelligence, but I was also there to go to another school, which was to uncover this ability that I had. I had the ability, but it was like I wasn't able to control it or to know it was there until it was uncovered to me, or so I could practice at it, so to speak. So he told me where to meet the van and told me all the logistics of how it would operate, and I started going to a school that would allow me to uncover this ability and to practice it, and that was at nighttime. In the daytime, I was going to my regular schooling for the job that I was in electronic intelligence.
Okay, so when he went into this facility, he wasn't allowed to speak to anyone. There was only one other person in the room, and he was sat at a desk with a very large computer screen, and there was a box with a line in it. Okay, and he had headphones on. Now, in the headphones, there was a tone played, so a musical tone, and he was asked to try and imagine that tone in his own mind. So, in other words, hum the tone, not audibly, but in his mind. And he was told that if he did it correctly, the line would move on the screen, would move down. And it took him weeks and weeks to get the hang of this, but eventually he mastered it. He could hum this tone in his head, and the line would move. And he wasn't connected to the computer in any way, he just had a pair of headphones on. So, because the computer system had an interfacing device added to it, which could read his mind, which allegedly, he claims, had been given to the Americans by ETs. So it was reading his brainwaves and feeding that into the computer. Okay, I'll let him explain a little bit more about that technology that he was trained on.
It was kind of like a biofeedback machine, but on a totally different level, because I wasn't connected to the machine at all. And it started out by having these boxes on a computer screen. I had these boxes and had an oscilloscope straight line through each one of the boxes. And I was told to concentrate on a tone that was being played in my ear on headphones, and the instructions were to mentally hum this tone. So if you think, that's a hard thing to do, is mentally hum. You're humming, yet it's not vocal and it's in your mind. But they said that's what you have to concentrate on, is to mentally hum. So I would mentally hum this particular tone that they would be playing in my earphones. And then at some point, I started to sense that the line that I was looking at when I was doing this was connected to my mind somehow, and that I could move it. But it took a while. It took several days for me to even, and that was just torture, 3 or 4 hours of just sitting there and mentally humming something for a couple days without any sense that something's actually going to happen. It's kind of like a sense of clicking. It wasn't an audible click, but it was like when you're up against this force, and then all of a sudden the force gives way, and you can go like, move your hand against that force, and move your hand quicker because the force has been taken away. That's kind of how it felt, is this resistance, and then the resistance gave way. And
so after he mastered moving one of these lines down, they put other lines on the screens and asked him to imagine humming a second tone, and he could move them independently. And then he eventually had a whole load of lines on the screens, and he could move them all up and down. And then at some point what they did was they showed him a whole load of pictures and emotions and things like that, which were associated with different combinations of these lines. So he was able to then learn an entire language of, well, what he terms it as intuitive communications, but it's essentially telepathy. So the computer system was able to read his intention and change things on the screen. But not only that, it was also able to feed things back into his mind.
This is an ability that is really, really concrete. I mean, it's like we are talking right now. You say something and it conveys a message, and it's a pretty solid message. If I need to clarify that message or ask you to clarify, I can ask you to clarify. But it's a very, very concrete communications that we're doing when we're talking. And that is the same way with the intuitive communications. There's no room for error.
Are you saying that you hear a voice in your head?
No, it's not a voice. The medium itself was not a visual medium. But when it got to me and my brain assessed that information, it put it into a picture for me so that I could understand, or my mind could convey, because I had to convey all these communications through a computer to some place that I have no idea where I went. But when I got a communication, I had to convey this communication. And so a lot of it was rendered in pictures in my head, but sometimes it was just rendered in language, English language. And sometimes it was rendered in smells even sometimes. I could sense a smell. The technology obviously came from the ET species that we were in contact with, but I wasn't at the school. I was not communicating with an ET. I was.
So he's mentioned there this, when he was being trained, he was trained for quite a few years at different bases in this technology, and they would send him messages through this machine, and he was told to type it into a computer. He had like a black window on the computer, and he would type it in. And he assumed that there was somebody else in the NSA basically reading those messages, checking to see if he'd picked up this language. But then at some point, I think he had to wait quite a long time for this active mission that he was in. He was taken to a facility where periodically there would be messages coming in. Now, and he believes that they were being communicated from an ET, directly from an ET, a telepathic message. Now, he doesn't know where this ET was situated. He says it could have been in the next room, or it could have been the other side of the galaxy. He doesn't know where it was, but he believes it was an ET, and he was able to actually have quite high-level telepathic communications with it at this facility. But he also talks about the specific information that he was being given as part of this program.
The whole point of me typing it into the computer, and so somebody somewhere could read it, was so that they could verify the information and for accuracy, because that's essentially what I was doing, was just honing my skills to make sure that I was accurately conveying the messages that were being conveyed to me. We had it was a C-van. It's called a C-van. It's kind of like a trailer but no wheels, and you go into it, and we had 2 stations in this van, and I worked one station and my partner worked the other station, and we couldn't be in the trailer apart from one another. We both had to be in the trailer at the same time. But he had no clue as to what I was doing with the Gray Project. It just so happens that some of that information seemed to me to be information about abductions. And that's the whole problem with this entire experience, is a lot of things just don't make any sense. I'm like, well, why would they be conveying that type of information to me? So maybe at some sort of future event, they were going to be using me to convey this type of information, abduction information. I have no idea, but I started to receive information, like you said, that really correlated to me, like it has something to do with abductions, because there were fields, so to speak, like when you're filling out a form, there were fields. Well, there were like these pieces of information that were like potentiality for recall. I remember that one, residual pain levels, and latitudes and longitudes. And so, I mean, maybe they weren't abduction scenarios or abduction information, but it really seemed to me that it was, because of the different bits of information that was being communicated.
Okay, so he was sent a string of information, and he received these messages fairly regularly before he started questioning them. Potentiality for recall. I mean, we know from the abduction phenomenon that people often have missing memories, that they go through pain as well, so there's a pain threshold. Now, we'll explain what I think this information is for. Latitude and longitude coordinates on the Earth of where the abduction is taking place and the date and time. Now, the string on the bottom here is an example of the data that he would be sent telepathically, that he had to type into this terminal at the NSA. This would then be sent to someone else, presumably at the NSA. He didn't know who they were, who would then interpret the information. Now, if you just look at that string, you've got a number, and then it says subject. Now, I think after the subject, that number, that identifies the person who's been abducted, /9400107, that is a date, 7th of January 94, which is when he was on the program. 0430, that's the time. potentiality for recall 72. So presumably if this is an abduction report, they've got a way of measuring how likely that person is able to recall it. Pain, residual pain, nerve response curve, body normalization, and then at the end there, the last string 03835 north, 14503 E east. So, for some reason, if this is true, there's some race giving information to the NSA about, we presume it's human beings who have been abducted. Now, Dan Sherman then, he got a bit concerned about this, especially things like pain thresholds coming through, and he started to question his superiors as to about what on earth it was that he was being used for.
Well, I mean, I didn't get hundreds of them. You know, I maybe got maybe a couple dozen or 3 dozen or maybe something like that. So it wasn't a lot of them. And to tell you the truth, I didn't really, until maybe I'd gotten a couple dozen of them or whatever, I didn't really start thinking, well, wait a minute, you know, it didn't really start dawning on me until I had received several of them that this might be something that is odd. And then right towards the end, and that's probably why I stopped getting them, is because I started to ask my handler about them, and what is this information? It seems like it's abductions, and it seems like there's pain, and you know, that type of thing. And the answer I always got back from my handler was, just communicate what you're told. You know, what is being communicated to you. Just communicate that to us, and don't ask questions. You're not here to ask questions. You're here to practice your ability.
Okay, and he was then taken off the project. Now, I'm going to try and give an explanation for this. In 1954, there was an alleged meeting with President Eisenhower. It's been written about by several authors. A meeting which took place between Eisenhower and a race of extraterrestrials. And there was a treaty drawn up, allegedly, in 1954. There were whistleblowers such as Phil Schneider who have spoken about this. Timothy Good has written about it through his contacts. And I believe there's a Cardinal McIntyre, who was the head of the Catholic Church in America. He has alluded to this meeting as well. Now, if you believe what people say about this meeting, this treaty that was supposedly drawn up, this is what was agreed, that there would be non-interference agreement between the human race and this race of extraterrestrials, that the government would help keep the extraterrestrials' presence secret, that there would be a technology handover. The ETs would hand over certain technology to the Americans, and that the US government would facilitate in the building of certain underground bases for these extraterrestrials. Now, some of the information that was allegedly agreed in this treaty is as follows: that these aliens, because the American military knew that abduction was going on, so this was obviously discussed, they could abduct humans on a limited basis for the purpose of medical examination and monitoring, with the stipulation that the humans would not be harmed, would be returned to their point of abduction, and that the humans would have no memory of the event. Okay? And this final bit, that the government requested that the ETs provide regular data on the abduction, lists of names, etc. So what I think this Dan Sherman thing is that's the ETs following up on their part of this agreement, that they are informing the NSA of their abductions as agreed in 1954. It does seem to tie in, and I think what's possibly happened, let's say that did take place, okay? The government have said, we want this information. Perhaps the extraterrestrial race has said, okay, we're not going to send it on your gas-powered electromagnetic waves. We're going to send it using our communication. You've got to learn our language, boy, if you want us to keep sending you information. And the Americans have maybe gone, well, how do you mean learn your language? Hence the technology handover for this biofeedback machine, and then the training of the likes of Sherman into this program, so that they've got people that can then communicate in their communication medium. Okay. And like I said, I think that the Dan Sherman story really is a big piece of the puzzle, which I think a lot of people overlook.